Congressman, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Polls have been up and down in your race. A month ago, it showed Cruz with a substantial lead. The most recent poll from the University of Houston had you guys virtually tied. What are internal polls showing you right now?
Well, I think it's always been a close race, and I think it's going to finish as a close race. What I want Texans to know is who I am, that I was born and raised here in Dallas by a single mom, went to public schools here. That was a big deal for us when I got a scholarship to Baylor, that I've played in the NFL, and that I've served in Congress in a way that shows you can bring folks together. And I think that's the exact opposite of how Ted Cruz has served us. And that, to me, as folks get to know that story, I think is one that we'll continue to see the polls tighten.
Well, let's talk about the big news in this race. Since you and I last spoke, Vice President Harris got in the race, President Biden got out of the race. She's generated massive momentum. How does that affect you and your campaign?
Yeah. Well, you know, I want to say that I do think that what President Biden did was historic in terms of putting your country first. I think it was the right thing to do. And this was a close race before he got out of the race, and it's still a close race now. But I certainly have seen a lot of folks who have felt inspired to get involved. And to me, that's really important in this race, but in any democracy, that folks are interested. We need to have people being engaged in this discussion, because this is a really important election. We're picking a senator who's going to serve us for the next 6 years, longer than the term of the next president. And I think that we have to have a real conversation as a state about what direction we want to go in. I want to go in a fundamentally different direction than the one I think Ted Cruz has taken us in.
Does she impact your campaign at all? Does she bring energy? Does she bring enthusiasm from voters to show up and help yours?
I think we've seen a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and I think that's great. But we also had that in many cases before. And so I think this is a continuation of that. I think a lot of Texans are fired up about moving on from Ted Cruz. They know we can't afford 6 more years of him. So I think enthusiasm is important, but now we also have to turn it into action and getting folks out to vote, which has been one of our biggest struggles here in Texas.
Let me ask the flip side of that. You were outperforming President Biden in the polls consistently. Does Vice President Harris drag on your campaign at all here?
I think this is a choice for Texans about who's going to be our next senator, and I think it always has been. That's why I think you saw the big discrepancy when President Biden was at the top of the ticket, and I think you'll see that also with Senator Harris, because this is a really important choice for us, as I said. This Senate term is going to last until 2030. Ted Cruz has had 12 years of showing us how he would lead, which to me is a way that pits us against each other, that doesn't actually get anything done, that spends a lot of time on himself, but not much time on Texans. I've been the most bipartisan Texan in Congress, as you know, Jason. It's really important to me. I will lead us in a fundamentally different direction, one that tries to bring us together around our shared values.
Last weekend you were in Houston and you launched the something called Texas Offense, or Get Out the Vote effort. Well, we saw 6 years ago Beto O'Rourke have a similar effort, just as large. How is yours different from his, though?
This is fundamentally different. And as you know, I was a linebacker. I played defense my whole career. Well, now we're going on offense. And that means coordinating for the first time in over 20 years, a real statewide coordinated campaign here in Texas. And so we're going to try and make sure that we're sharing data, sharing resources, and really being much more efficient with what we're doing. So it's
sharing it with whom? With the party, with other candidates, with who?
Yeah, up and down the ballot. And I think that's really important in terms of efficiency. But this is about us, talking to Texans, Texans talking to Texans, neighbors talking to neighbors, making sure that we get the vote out, but also that we have these really hard and important conversations about what direction we want to go in. And this is going to help with that. And to me, that's a good thing.
I want to ask you about some news of the day happening here, too. President Biden's proposed these significant changes to the U.S. Supreme Court, term limits for justices, ethics disclosures, just like other federal judges have. Is that something you support?
Yeah, I have always supported the ethics changes, and I think that's really important.
How about term limits?
Yeah, I think I want to look at it more and understand the way that would operate. I do think that the original intention of the Supreme Court probably wasn't for folks to serve on there for 40 years, right? That wasn't the expectation. And so I think we've gotten away from probably the original intention there, and I think we're seeing that we do need to constantly have discussions about how we can improve our democracy. And if that will help, then it's something I'll support. But I want to look at it and consider it more. But I do think that when it comes to particularly ethics, that this is something that should have happened a long time ago, and that the Supreme Court has in a lot of ways brought this on themselves with some of their activities and really questioning the legitimacy of some of what they're doing.
I don't think anyone would disagree about that. Let's talk about some issues here for a moment. You talked about abortion a lot, reproductive rights, women's right to choose, and that's resonated with a lot of Democratic voters. Immigration's another issue you have a strong ad out on too. Let's talk about inflation, though. Democrats have continually had trouble with inflation over the past few years. Energy costs have come down, food prices have not. What do you tell Texans who are still concerned that, listen, my dollar is not going as far, I can't do as much for my family as I was once doing?
Listen, this is my life story. I was raised by a single mom who was a public school teacher, and unfortunately, we don't pay our teachers enough. And so, I know what it's like to go through the grocery line and have to put something away because you can't afford that this week, or to swipe your debit card and say a little prayer. That's been my life story, and so that's why I've always been so focused on lowering Texans' costs where I can. On prescription drugs, for example, where we cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for folks on Medicare, and try to do it for everyone, but Ted Cruz and others opposed us in doing that. We're trying to make sure that we have really important policies in place that help you save money in those early years where you're trying to raise a family. That's something that my wife and I have been going through, certainly ourselves. But I'm always trying to find ways to save Texans money where we can, and we are going to continue to see this inflation come down.
I want to ask you about the, let's do this. We're a little more than 90 days away right now from the November election. Do you think that Texans are going to see you and Senator Cruz in a debate face to face?
I certainly hope so, and I'm ready to debate. Obviously, it'll be up to Senator Cruz what he wants to do, but I think it's an important thing for Texans to see, and I look forward to having that. How
many times will you debate him? Have you challenged him? Have you spoken to his team about that?
We're having discussions right now, yeah.
Getting ready for this interview, I was at soccer practice last night, and a fellow dad mentioned this to me. He's asked what I was doing over there on the laptop as my kid was playing. But he said, Allred is as agreeable as Cruz is disagreeable. He says, I know what Ted Cruz stands for. I'm not really sure what Colin Allred stands for, though. What do you tell those Texans? Who Cruz has dyed the wool, you know exactly where he is on issues, and people have seen you be bipartisan and work across the aisle, but they're not really sure where you are. What do you tell them?
Well, listen, I want Texans to know that I'm always going to be on their side, and that's the fundamental difference, I think, between us, is that I'm looking for ways to get things done to help Texans in a bipartisan way most often. Over 70% of the bills that I've co-sponsored in Congress have been bipartisan. You and I have talked about the work we've done for veterans here in North Texas, creating a new VA hospital in Garland. That's just one example, though, of trying to find every way I can to be on their side and help them. And to me, that's not an ideological approach. We know that Senator Cruz is one of the most ideological people you'll ever come across. Everything he sees is in terms of whether it's Democrats or Republicans. I've never been that way, probably because of my athletic background and all of that. But I'm always trying to look for how I can help the folks that I grew up with, the folks that I know helped me get to where I am. This community, North Texas, our state, this place that has given me a chance to chase my version of the American dream. And so if you want to know where I'll stand, it's going to be on your side, on every issue. And that is always my barometer.
You're obviously a Democrat, but would you say you're less party affiliated, more country first? I mean, what would you tell Texans?
I've always tried to be, and that's why I'm proud to have been named the most bipartisan Texan in Congress. I've been given awards for that, and I think it's partly just the way I approach things. I don't see an issue as a Democratic or Republican issue. I try and think about it through the lens of being a Texan. I'm a fourth-generation Texan. I think I know who we are. My family's from Brownsville. I went to Baylor. I grew up here in Dallas. I have an understanding of who Texans are, and I try and make sure that I'm both leading us in the direction I know we should be going, but also being responsive to what I know our needs are.
6 years in Congress, what would you say your two greatest legislative victories are?
Well, my greatest, I think, victory is not a legislative one. I think it's creating the VA hospital, which
in Garland,
which is something that took over a year, creating 5,000 jobs. A $400 million facility would have cost us $1 billion to make, and it's helping us better serve our veterans. And I'm really proud of that. And I think that that's something that shows what it's possible, even working with the Trump administration, to get done.
And you had to work with the Trump administration.
Yeah, it was a long process with them, and working with the city of Garland, and trying to make sure that we're kind of putting a square peg in a round hole there, getting the government to accept a hospital.
What else?
Well, I think my other biggest legislative accomplishment is also a veterans bill to build major medical facilities across our state, a new veterans facility in El Paso, but also to build a spinal cord injury center here in Dallas. And I think you might see the theme here. This is also with Jake Ellzey, congressman here in North Texas.
Republican congressman.
Republican. These are bipartisan efforts. And to me, I try and find that area where I know we can agree. But I was one of the main people responsible for us passing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. That wouldn't have passed if it weren't for Texans like me working actually with the Trump administration to get that across the board, to pass the infrastructure bill, which I was on the committee and help shepherd that through, passing the CHIPS and Science Act, which is helping bring high-tech manufacturing back to our state. There's so many things that I can point to that played a key role in, and there's some things that I haven't gotten done yet that I want to, like making sure we can protect a woman's right to choose and protecting your right to vote.
Before we go, anything else you'd like to tell Texans that people aren't watching in this race they should be watching, because the clock is really ticking now?
The clock is ticking, but I hope the Texans will get involved, and I hope that they'll stand up and understand that our democracy is not a spectator sport. You're not watching teams play it out. This is not a football game, right? You're one of the players on the field. So be engaged, make your voice heard. The most important thing you can do is to be engaged in an election like this. Go vote, go to colinallred.com and get involved.
Congressman, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I appreciate it.